In this problem we are given several either multiplication problems or division problems, and we are to perform that indicated operation. If ever we have a problem where the answer does not exist, we are to write D and E for that problem. So one way to do the problem is to systematically go through and look at each of the multiplication problems. I see about 3 of them, and we will look at them differently than we will the division problems. So to do the first one I saw, -8 times 0, one thing you can do with multiplication and division is start by looking just at the absolute values of the numbers. To multiply -8 times 0, you could think of that as multiplying 8 times 0, and we'll worry about the sign on the answer at the end. And one way to think of multiplication of numbers is that the first number is the number of copies of things you're going to make, and that the second number is the number of objects in each copy. So we have 0 objects in each copy, and we want to make 8 copies of that. Since 0 means you have nothing, having 8 copies of nothing still means you have nothing. That gives us a total of 0. So that would give you the number 0, and then like I said, at the end of the problem you would determine the sign. And it turns out if the signs are different with multiplication, the answer is negative. But in this special case, because the answer is 0, 0 is the only number that doesn't have a sign. That -0, for example, can be thought of as the opposite of 0, and the opposite of 0 is nothing more than just 0. So that one would be 0. Another one that I see is 0 times 8, which would be a very similar explanation. Putting the 0 on the left and an 8 on the right actually does not change the answer. This time you'd have 8 objects in each copy, but you'd have 0 copies. If you have 0 copies of that, that means you have nothing. So that would mean that the total is 0. So I'll put a 0 here, and as always at the end you should worry about the sign on your final answer. In this case it won't matter because 0 always has no sign, but if you wanted, a positive times a positive means the signs are the same, which means your final answer would be positive. The only other multiplication problem I see is 8 times 1, and if you want, 8 times 1 can be thought of as that you have 1 object in each copy, so here's 1 object, but we are to make 8 copies of it. So if I was to make 8 copies of 1 object, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, you'd have 8 copies of 1 object, but that would mean you have 8 things. So the total would be 8. So 8 times 1 is 8. So I will write 8 here. And the fact that both signs were positive, whenever the signs are the same, your final answer will be positive, so I would leave this positive 8. It turns out that any number times 1 would give the original number. 8 times 1 is 8, but if it were a different number, say 7, 7 times 1 would be 7, for example. Now the rest of the problems are division problems, so let me get rid of this here and pick a division problem like 8 divided by 1. The way we thought of this in many videos is that the first number is the total number of things, and the second number is the number of objects in each copy, and the answer would be the number of copies that it takes of that many objects to make a total of 8. If the number of things in each of my copy is 1 thing, how many copies of it would it take to make 8? So here's my first copy of 1 object, and my second copy of 1 object would look like this, and you would continue to do so until you found out that you would have to make 8 copies, and in each copy you would have 1 thing, so this is the number of objects in each copy, 1, and again it would take 8 copies of that 1 object, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, to make a total of 8. So it took 8 copies of 1 object to make a total of 8. So 8 divided by 1 turns out to be 8. So I will write 8 here, and just like multiplication, at the end of a division problem, you determine the sign on your final answer by determining whether the original 2 numbers had the same sign or different signs. Both these numbers were positive, so the answer is going to be positive as well. Whenever the signs are the same, the final answer comes out to be positive, regardless if it's a division problem or a multiplication problem. Well, -8 divided by 1 will be easy to explain, because what you do is you take the absolute values of the numbers, then do the division. The absolute value of -8 is 8, the absolute value of 1 is 1, So you first perform that division, but we just did that problem. 8 divided by 1 came out to be 8, so that would be part of the answer. But in the end, you always determine the sign on your final answer by looking at the signs of the original two numbers. Here the signs were different. This number was negative, this number was positive, and whenever the signs are different, your final answer will come out negative, regardless if it's a division problem or a multiplication problem. It turns out another easy problem to do would be this one here. Negative 8 divided by negative 1 is going to be easy to explain, because to do this you first take the absolute values of the two numbers. The absolute value of negative 8 is 8, the absolute value of negative 1 is 1, and then you perform that division, and we've done that problem already. In fact, I think we did it twice. 8 divided by 1 came out to be 8, and then to find the sign of the final answer, you compare the signs in the original two and decide whether they're the same sign or different. Well, both of the numbers were negative, so they had the same sign, and whenever the two numbers have the same sign, your final answer comes out to be positive, so this would be a positive 8. So you could think of this as how many ones are there in 8, and there are 8 ones in 8. That gives us the 8, and then the fact that the signs are the same means the final answer is positive 8. To pick another problem, let's start with 8 divided by 8, because the answer to that problem will help us answer this one, and this one, because essentially they all involve taking 8 and dividing by 8. Sometimes the 8s are positive, sometimes negative. But when we do those problems, you'll see that ultimately they all come out very similar to explain. So first I will do 8 divided by 8, and I will explain this in the standard way. We want a total of 8 things, and the number of things in each of my copies or groups will be 8. How many copies of 8 does it take to make 8? So if you had 8 things, if you want, we'll think of 8 positive chips, but you could make the argument with any group of 8 things. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So here's 8 things. Here's my first copy. And then the question would be, what number of copies would I have to make of these 8 objects to get a total of 8? Well, I already have a total of 8 by making my first copy, so the answer is 1. If you had 1 copy of 8 things, that would give you a total of 8. Or you can think of it as, how many 8s are there in 8, and there's only 1. As soon as you write down 1 8, you already have the total for which you're looking for. So 8 divided by 8 turns out to be 1. It turns out whenever you have any number divided by itself, the answer would be 1. Let me write that down, because I'm going to use this result to argue the other problems. So for example, this problem, and this problem, I would explain all 3 of those by saying that you first start by taking the absolute values of the two numbers and then dividing. Well, the absolute value of negative 8 is 8, and I've already written that. And the absolute value of 8 is 8, and I've already written that. And I'd use that argument for this problem. The absolute value of 8 is 8. The absolute value of negative 8 is 8. So with absolute values, you'd have 8 divided by 8. And then in this problem, if you took the absolute values, the absolute value of negative 8 is 8. And the absolute value here of negative 8 is 8. Meaning the first step of doing all 3 problems involve doing 8 divided by 8. And we've already found that that answer was 1. So all 3 answers here are going to involve the number 1. So I'll put a 1 here, a 1 here, and a 1 here. But at the end of those 3 problems, you're always going to find the sign on your final answer by determining if the signs are the same or whether they're different. And the rule is, if the signs are different, which is this case, the answer comes out to be negative. This was a negative, that was a positive. Different signs means that the final answer will be negative. Same thing here. This one's positive, this one's negative, and when the signs are different, your final answer comes out to be negative. In this case, the signs were the same. This was negative, and whenever the signs are the same, your final answer comes out positive, so I'll leave that as a positive 1. So now that leaves only 2 problems left to look at. We have negative 8 divided by 0, and we have 0 divided by 8. I'll start by doing 0 divided by 8. If I write 0 divided by 8, you can look at the problem as I'm going to make several groups of things, and in each group or each copy I'm going to have 8 things. You can use 8 chips or 8 dots or 8 of anything really. So here is one group or one copy of 8, and the question is, what number of copies do I have to make of these 8 things so that they all add up to be 0? Well, if I put one copy down, I already have too many. My goal is to get a total of 0. So putting a second copy would be even more yet, and I would never get to 0 that way. The solution is to put 0 copies. So here's one copy of 8. If I had 0 copies, that would be already here. See, there's 0 copies here. By leaving it blank, I've made 0 copies of 8. So you could think of as the answer is 0. Having 0 copies of 8 things would give you a total of 0. Because if you had no copies, that means you would have nothing, and that's exactly what we want. Our goal was to have a total of 0, which means nothing. So 0 divided by 8 is 0. You either know or eventually will know that whenever you have 0 divided by a number, that almost always gives you 0. There's only one exception. 0 divided by almost all numbers ends up being 0. The one exception is if that number is 0. 0 divided by 0 is a special case, and I'll address that in a second. In the last problem, we have negative 8 being divided by 0, and this is going to be very difficult to do. Because imagine over here I make a group of objects so that there are 0 objects in each copy. So there's nothing in this group, or this copy if you want. So I have 0 things here, and that's the number of objects in each copy. The idea is, how many copies of nothing do I have to make, the number of copies of 0 objects, so that I get a total of 8? Now it says negative 8, but you can temporarily disregard the sign. When you take negative 8 and divide by 0, the first step would be to take the absolute values of the numbers. So the first step would be to do 8 divided by 0, and it really wouldn't matter. We'd have the same issue. How do you take several groups of nothing and put them together to get a total of 8? It doesn't matter how many zeros you add together, you're always going to get 0, and you'll never get 8. So because there's no answer to the problem, you can think of the answer does not exist. There is no answer. So if 8 divided by 0 does not exist, negative 8 divided by 0 would also not exist, because to do the problem where the 8 was negative, you take the previous answer found here, where we divided the numbers after taking absolute values, and you are to say that the signs are different or the same, and then determine what the sign on the final answer is. But the answer does not exist, doesn't have a sign. So it turns out that whenever you divide by 0, there's no meaningful way to define that, or you could think of it as there's just no way to answer the problem. There's no number of zeros that you'll ever get coming out to have a total of 8. So you either know or are going to learn that whenever you have any number divided by 0, this turns out to be undefined, or if you want, it comes out to be a problem for which the answer does not exist. Any number divided by 0 does not exist, and if you put it the other way around, 0 divided by any number, I said a few minutes ago that that is almost always 0, and that's true. 0 divided by any number is 0 except for this one. We just said if the number here was 0, the answer would not exist. So think of it as 0 divided by any number but 0 would give you 0. But if you had a number divided by 0, that would not exist. And oftentimes you'll see these problems written vertically rather than horizontally, so you'll hear people explain it slightly different. If the 0 is in the numerator, you almost always get 0 as an answer. If your 0 is in the bottom of the fraction or the denominator, division by 0 is undefined. You can't do it. It simply does not exist. So as soon as I saw division by 0 in this problem, I could have told you the answer is D and E.